So, the second case study in community engagement that I want to share with you is one which I am intimately familiar because it's a series of projects I directed with new immigrant communities in Philadelphia from 1997 to 2004 for the Balch Institute for Ethnic Studies, which was, at that time, a library, archive, and museum devoted to the immigrant and ethnic experience in the United States. These projects, which we loosely referred to as the New Immigrants Initiative, were an attempt to update and diversify our collections and engage local communities to document their experience in history by collecting oral histories, community ephemera, and documenting events, community activities, and other organizations through photography and videography, and producing interpretations and educational materials from that documentation, such as exhibits, publications, public programs, and teacher's guides. And this is actually an image from two different exhibits that I worked on. One on the left is a Liberian social worker who's pointing to his picture on the wall, and then a second one was a project with South Asians, and this is Mrs. Patel pointing to pictures of her daughter's wedding. And you can kind of see the museum effect working here, elements of people's family lives and everyday lives suddenly taking on significance when they are on the walls of a museum. These projects were an answer in practice to what constitutes sharing authority and what conditions allow for authority to be shared, how we do public history when the stories we want to interpret don't already live in the archives or museum, and what does the past in public mean for groups who have historically been underrepresented in public culture and institutions such as museums. So the point of these projects was to assist local immigrant communities in efforts to document their experience, get their voices and lives into the archives and on the historical record, but also to work collaboratively to facilitate the interpretation and sharing of that history, ultimately with the goal of amplifying the voices and experiences of these newer communities in Philadelphia. How do we create meaningful representations of history that speak to multiple audiences and constituencies that public historians serve, the public at large, colleagues, and the immigrant communities themselves, all at the same time? And from these projects, I learned a lot about community engagement. I learned that community engagement necessitates a nuanced understanding of community, an understanding that communities are not homogeneous and have a lot of internal diversity across different generations, different genders, different class statuses, and even sexual identity and other identifications which diversify our sense of community. Community engagement shares authority and amplifies community voices as part of the historical record. Community engagement is sensitive to structures of power and difference, both between the institution and the community, between different communities, and between community members themselves, in relation especially to those aforementioned differences. Community engagement incorporates community input and dialogue through shared inquiry at every stage of the project, at the beginning, as the project is being formed, as the themes are being identified, and then at the end in terms of gauging impact. Community engagement demystifies the public history process for non-professionals, for real inclusion, helping them understand how museums work or how historical societies work, where the funding comes from, how projects get planned, what kinds of resources we need, so that their input can be real and meaningful. Community engagement crafts products that have meaning for the community, maybe not just museum exhibits or the kinds of things that we want to do in museums, but rather projects that also speak to community needs and interests. And finally, community engagement involves flexibility on the part of the historian and the historical institution. Sometimes we can't just do business as usual, and we have to rethink our project plans, our timelines, our funding bases in order to make what the community wants to do possible. Addressing the concerns of the present while collecting the past means listening carefully to what the community has to say about that present and incorporating it into the representations you create. Share authority by listening and asking for feedback. I learned this lesson first by training in ethnography and history as a graduate student in folklore. That was the theory. After graduate school, when I was hired to work at the Balch Institute for Ethnic Studies, I had to confront and figure out how that worked in practice. My first lesson came shortly after I was hired at the Balch, when we worked on an exhibit about Philadelphia's Chinatown. The exhibit was supposed to open in my first 6 months on the job. The focus of the exhibit and the oral history project was on the Save Chinatown movement, the efforts that the community members had historically undertaken to prevent urban renewal projects from destroying their community. In particular, they resisted a crosstown expressway in the late 60s and early 70s. We wanted to represent the efforts that the community had made to preserve that community. As we were finishing up the exhibit, we went to show the outline and the materials to our project advisors, one of whom was Cecilia Moyep, who is the woman pictured on the left, a longtime resident of Chinatown, head of the Chinatown Development Corporation, and a kind of unofficial mayor of Chinatown. We laid all the materials out on the table and asked people what they thought. And Cecilia said, well, this is fine, but we need more images of Chinatown as it is now. She said a representation of their past that did not take the continued struggle into account wasn't useful to them. In other words, we didn't just struggle in the past, we're struggling today, and the reason we're struggling is because we want to keep our neighborhood a living community, not a historically pure museum or a bunch of restaurants. So we had not structured their input into the early stages of our planning to see what kind of exhibit they wanted to see. We just assumed that it was going to be about Save Chinatown in the past. And we had no materials or strategy to address their concerns at this point. A big oversight. So I went out and took pictures of Chinatown, along with borrowing images from a community activism group to supplement what we had collected. And we created a new final section of the exhibit that focused on Chinatown today, and in particular focused on the kinds of organizations, activities, and businesses that were not restaurants. Beauty salons, tax accountants, driving schools, a dentist, other activist organizations, Chinese cultural church groups, and so forth, to round out our picture of Chinatown today. Or then, this was in the late 1990s. And this largely spoke to the concerns that the community had. And the project taught me that working with communities involves the creation of what we call a usable past in public history. It speaks to the present, emerging from a dialogue relationship between the legacies of the past, the struggles of the present, the promises of the future, and between the historian and the community members. It points to the fact that this exchange is an ongoing negotiation of meaning that any community-focused project entails. So our experience with the Chinatown Project taught us that we needed to build dialogue into our programs from the very beginning and think about representation, the negotiation of that at the very, very beginning, what we call front-end assessment. Sometimes we may have a desire to work in a certain way, but we don't necessarily have the understandings or processes to do it. We had to create that. Working with communities takes time, thought, patience, and flexibility. It involves sharing authority, embracing dialogue as a research process, both in terms of listening and collecting from the community, but also bringing those materials into dialogue with what historians have written, what the established narratives are, what the audience might need, any constraints of funders or other collaborators, budget, design, board members. Any stakeholders can bring an agenda to the process, and it's only through negotiating the meaning that a final project can emerge and really live in the public sphere. Sharing authority also means negotiating differential knowledge bases as well as differential identities and experiences. Having a series of honest and detailed conversations about what it takes to make what they want to see happen, what the limits of my organization were, what they saw, what we saw, and so forth. Sometimes I sat down with the project budget, went over each line item, talked about their priorities, and engaged in collective decision-making together. I had to demystify the institutional process, explain how much things cost, for instance. How much does it cost to mount an exhibit? If you have a $20,000 grant, what will that buy you? What's possible, what's not possible? So that their input could be really meaningful, and it wasn't just we were asking them what they thought, but we really didn't have the means to make it happen. And this is particularly important if we're working with communities that haven't collaborated with museums or other kinds of historical organizations in the past. They may not really know how they work, and so we want to help make it relevant and accessible to them. Community engagement also means acknowledging that there are inherent interpretive dilemmas sometimes, especially if the community doesn't agree, and we have to seek creative solutions that all participants can agree on or at least participate in. This certainly became a real issue when we did a project with Latino communities in Philadelphia, which we called Latino Philadelphia, Our Journeys, Our Communities. This was a very diverse collection of communities under the umbrella of Latino. And we had to really negotiate between the stories of the historic contributions of predominantly Puerto Rican residents, who were also a dominant majority within the community and most of the representations of the community, and who had created most of the institutions of the Latino community to date. We had to balance that with the perspective of more recent arrivals. So we had to involve and recognize the Latino establishment while also involving and recognizing those that the Latino establishment was struggling itself to respond to. We also had to balance between positive and negative information about the Latino community experience and how that could be communicated in a nuanced but understandable way. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And finally, we had to problematize the very idea of Latino identity, because some of the people that we were working with didn't identify as Latino. They identified as Hispanic, or as their national origin, as Puerto Rican, as Honduran, as Colombian, as Dominican, or maybe some combination thereof. So we had to figure out how to represent this complexity in a way that people could understand, but also that the community could feel comfortable with. So we came up with a couple of solutions in the exhibit itself to this problem. As you can see, it was a very long, narrow space, and so we didn't have a lot of flexibility in what we could do. But it did sort of lend itself to looking at things across from each other parallel. So one of the first things that we did was we problematized the idea of Latino identity in the exhibit itself by showing the diversity of the Latino communities and the ways in which they identified. So we had things like a phone card chart that had the different numbers of population of different national origins. In the Philadelphia area, we had portraits of many different Latinos in the community. We also had these little placards that hung down that had quotes from people about their identity. So in this case, I'm Venezuelan, but I'm half Dominican, and I love Puerto Rico. I'm Latina. And so a lot of these were around, and we called this the bodega, the marketplace of Latino identity. So what we were doing in this exhibit is we were using ideas of space within the Latino barrio to represent different themes within the Latino experience. So the marketplace became where we problematized Latino identity. We also had early in the exhibit a little casita, which represented the history of Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia. We also had, this is more of the Latino marketplace. We also focused on the issue of neighborhood space and some of the challenges that Latino communities experienced in Philadelphia historically, or what they called la lucha, the struggle. And this was where we really got into a series of complicated discussions with our community representatives, our community advisors, about what the balance of interpretation was going to be. So we had been told a lot about La Lucha, about the issues of struggle of Latinos, and so we drafted an exhibit script that reflected that narrative. And we sat down with the community advisors, and they were like, well, this is fine, but we're tired of always being portrayed as poor and drug-ridden. We've made a lot of contributions to the city. We've done a lot of good things. We want to see that reflected in the exhibit. So we went back, we rewrote the script, and then we came back again and we shared it with them. And they said, well, that's fine, but we have a lot of real challenges in this community. We have the highest rate of poverty in the city. We have real problems with drugs and blight in our community that we're struggling with. And so at that point, I said, okay, let's just stop and talk about this. Let's stop and talk about this dilemma that we're having of how to balance this narrative. And what we eventually came up with after a series of conversations is that we would use this idea of space and the transformation of space to portray both the challenges in the environment that Latinos were struggling with and having to cope with, but also some of the creative and resilient ways in which they responded culturally as a community to those challenges. So we had this long passage where we had the blighted block, which is shown here. And then on the blighted block, we had what you saw on the last slide, which was a contrast between images of blighted spaces and then what those spaces had become. So a burned out factory became a bilingual school. A drug corner became a community garden with a mural. So this was the kind of transformation that we were showing of that. And then we also were playing around with the idea of windows and mirrors. This is actually a mural that's painted on this window that's in part of Philadelphia where Puerto Ricans used to live, that they were displaced from. And then we focused on the different ways of cultural expression in the community, playing on this idea of the community mural. And you see there's a lot of images of community murals here, along with other images of cultural events. So, the process of negotiating meaning requires a sustained and strategic series of reflexive dialogues and interpretive compromises. We did not wholly cede authority to any one constituency, but we did privilege the perspective of the subjects being represented so as to maximize their place at a table where they rarely get to sit. We also tried to be explicit about our attempts to create spaces and processes for dialogue so that even if people weren't totally satisfied, at least they could see their own hand in the process and the product. This work is important because to the extent that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are as a people matter, we want those stories to be as inclusive as possible. Only by bringing people and communities into the process of history making can we really do this. And when we do this, we may find that projects turn out in a way different from what we expected if we open our process up to the kinds of ideas and needs and issues that the community brings into the process. And this brings me to the point about community engagement involves crafting products that make sense to the community. We certainly learned this when we did a project called Extended Lives with African immigrant communities in Philadelphia. Now, this was a community very loosely conceived since there were about 15 smaller communities of different national origin and ethnicities within that umbrella of African immigrant. And this project also involved a lot of the methods I just talked about, doing oral histories, documenting community events. The photographs that you see here were all images that were taken by our project photographer in different community contexts. And we had a group of community advisors representing a lot of different African communities who helped us think about what the themes of the project would be, what kinds of people we should meet, events we should attend, things we should document, and so forth. About halfway through that process, the curator, Lee, who was an Africanist, an anthropologist, and had specialized in African studies, noticed that in talking to a lot of the leaders of African community organizations, a lot of them had a lot of the same needs, issues, struggles, challenges, and they didn't necessarily know each other. And they also didn't necessarily know how to address some of these issues in terms of what kinds of services were available in the city and so forth. So we decided to take a moment and create an event specifically for the leaders of these community organizations. We held it in the basement auditorium of the museum. We hired a Nigerian chef to cater the dinner. And we had a dinner, and then representatives from the different city agencies, the chief of police, the language access officer of the school district, and so health and human services, and so forth, all gave presentations about services that they had for the African communities, and also leaders got a chance to ask questions. It was really interesting because after the city reps went home, a lot of the leaders of the community organizations stayed and talked and shared their experiences. And I don't remember who it was, but somebody said, we really should form an organization to represent us all, a coalition of all of our different organizations. And in fact, that's what they did. And the museum that I worked at helped make it possible, in part because we brought these leaders together. Then we also offered them some space to meet in the basement auditorium. Over the next 6 months, we Xeroxed their early flyers. The first one is shown here on this slide, and helped mail them out to the different organizations and their representatives. And we met with them, helped them out for the first, 6 months, 9 months that they were organizing. They eventually got their own meeting space. They eventually created their own membership and communications functions, and eventually incorporated as a 501c3. They still exist today, sponsor annual health fairs, meet with local politicians and other city representatives to advocate on behalf of their communities. And what was interesting is when we did our assessment at the end of the project and we asked our community advisors what part of the project had the most impact for you or was the most meaningful for you, a majority of them said AFRICOM, which was the coalition that they created. But they associated it with our project because we brought them together. And for them, it was the most meaningful thing that came out of that project, regardless of what happened with the exhibit or any of the programs or any of that. AFRICOM was what really mattered to them. And so when we actually engage communities on their own terms and think, what can we do that they could really benefit from or need within the boundaries of our mission as a museum or organization, we can have some really interesting things come out of that. And that involves thinking outside of the box. Thinking outside of the box in terms of what you do as a public historian and also what projects look like. A lot of times you'll get a grant to do an exhibit or a special project or collect oral histories, and then when the grant money runs out, the project ends, and that's kind of it. But if we think of community engagement as a kind of relationship creation, creating relationships between our organization, our museum, and different community entities, then we need to think about how are we going to sustain those relationships. One of the things that we did was we remained in contact with people, and we're always looking for ways to keep our relationship going, to collaborate with them in different ways. On the one, and this slide represents two things that we did out of the Latino Communities Project over several years after that project technically ended. In the first instance, one of our community advisors, Johnny Irizarry, was the head of a historic settlement house in North Philadelphia called the Lighthouse. Now, this lighthouse had originally served, Eastern European immigrant worker families at the turn of the century, now served a predominantly Latino and African American client base. And Johnny thought it was really important that the kids who went to the settlement house understood the history of the neighborhood, the way it had been in the past, how it had changed, and how it could possibly change in the future. Now, it turns out that our historical society actually had some of the lighthouse's historical papers in our archives. And Johnny offered to donate another series of papers, from more recent papers from the lighthouse, which we gladly accepted and worked to process. One of our archivists also worked with Johnny to create out of those papers a small exhibit, a photo exhibit that was then mounted in the hallways and the stairwells of the lighthouse building itself, and was co-curated with Johnny, the archivist, and one of the young people groups there at the lighthouse, people who were involved in the programs there. And that was a really effective way to continue that relationship and also add to our archives as well. On the right, you'll see a mural, and there are a lot of murals in Philadelphia, and this was one that we worked on in collaboration with the Mural Arts Program and a couple of the Latino organizations that we knew from that project. And this is a mural that represents the Mexican American community in Philadelphia, which was a relatively recent immigrant community compared to some of the others. And we worked with them to mine the archives for images that they could then use in the mural and help with the collaborative process, and were there when the mural was dedicated. So this was one way in which we could really keep that relationship going. And we revisited these communities again and again in subsequent years. We did neighborhood tours. We did a multi-ethnic website project that also involved these communities again in conversation with other immigrant communities we had worked with on other projects. And so we sustained that relationship over time. And even today, the Historical Society that I used to work with still does collaborative projects with Latino communities in Philadelphia. They recently launched a website on the Puerto Rican experience in Philadelphia. So community engagement is more than just going out and collecting. It's really thinking about what kind of relationship are you forging with community members? How are you involving them in the work of your organization? and working to craft something with them. And again, flexibility, dialogue, listening, collaboration, all of this goes a long way towards building trust and making new kinds of history making possible.